Thanks for joining us here at Rose Quartz Mediumship podcast, where we simply adore anything and everything healing and metaphysically based. I want to share with you one of the most effective tools that I used when I was learning how to surrender more deeply. And I was learning how to tell a different story around experiences that I was having. And so I wanted to share this tip or trick with you in the event that it's something that's helpful for you as well. So when things were happening in my reality that I was in resistance to, that I might put the label of bad or unpleasant on, I started to write them down in my journal. And what I would do is I would leave a couple of lines underneath the bad experience that I had. And so I would just name it, "This thing happened." And then I would leave a couple of spaces. And a week later, I would go back in my journal and I would write down the lesson that I learned from that quote unquote bad experience. And I found that really effective. It started to help me really see that there were lessons in every bad experience. And then I started to take it a step further. So a couple of weeks later, I would go back in my journal and I had written down the bad experience that I'd had, the lesson that I'd learned out of it. And then I would write down how I had used that lesson over the past couple of weeks. And that became really effective for me to ground that lesson into me more deeply, because sometimes I noticed that I would get a lesson and then it would kind of float out the other side and it would be gone, and I wouldn't be maximizing or using that lesson as deeply as I could. And so I noticed when I went back in my journal and really grounded that into me, it did a couple of things. One, it brought my awareness to it. And I was able to see the beauty of this experience that had been labeled as bad, because there was a lesson, I was embodying that lesson, I'd integrated it into my life, I could point out the ways to myself that had happened. And then the other thing that it did was that when bad things started happening, I started to really look for what is the lesson and how am I going to use this lesson, rather than releasing or letting the lesson go. And so I did that for a period of time. And then I realized if I went back to all of those quote unquote bad things that had happened to me, and I looked them up in my journal months later, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months later, and I started to write out, how did this lesson shift my life for the positive? And that was kind of like the icing on the cake, right? I'd already figured out what the lesson was. I'd already been able to observe or witness inside of myself how I was embodying the lesson, or if I'd forgotten about the lesson, it gave me the opportunity to go back and embody it and integrate it into my life. But then when I was able to start seeing how that lesson shifted the trajectory of my life in a positive way, that was when magic happened for me. Because I went from being in a place where I would feel frustrated by the negative or bad things that were happening to me, right? It was to me. It was happening to me. There's a little bit of victim energy there. I can absolutely admit that. But when I was really able to look at how this negative or bad thing was actually a blessing and a shifted my life into a positive trajectory. There was a very clear positive impact on my life as a result of this negative thing. Sometimes it took me a year to be able to really get the icing on the cake here. But when I did that work, when I went back and I would look, I started to see that nothing bad was happening in my life. There was nothing bad happening to me at all. Everything was positive and happening for me. And it really put me in this place where when something that was uncomfortable or unexpected or just not the way that I would pick it if I got to pick my reality was happening in my reality, it left me in a spot being curious. It left me in this spot of deep knowing and trust and surrender that what was happening in my reality was absolutely happening for me. And I couldn't wait to figure out how it was happening for me. There was this really deep level of trust that I learned with that process. And then I started keeping a journal that was just these kind of bad things, right? And it just grounded into me that absolutely everything in my reality is a blessing, is a positive. Sometimes I don't understand it in the moment that it's happening. And so when I get into those spaces where I can't see how this is a positive, it's happening for me, I have a whole journal full of evidence that tells me that it is, that this experience is happening for me, even if I don't understand how yet. And so it led me into this place of really deep surrender and trust and knowing. And I no longer sat in a victim spot when things were happening to me, because I knew that they weren't happening to me. I knew that they were happening for me. And it allowed me to really lean into this place of surrender and trust and knowing that was absolutely stunning. And that was one of the primary things that I did to shift the story that was happening in my mind, that these quote unquote bad things or these negative things were happening in my life. Because I had a ton of evidence that said that it was happening for me. And it resulted in this inner peace and this trust and this knowing that I'm held by the universe. And I don't always understand it. I don't have to. I don't have to understand it. It's not my job, right? I'm not God. I'm not the universe. Am I a small piece? Yes, I am. But sometimes I need to remind myself that I don't need to know how or why something is happening. I just need to trust in the evidence that I have that says that this is happening for me and that it will shift my life in a positive direction, especially if I can be present with the lessons that came from the experience and ground them into me deeply and embody them deeply and integrate them into my life. And then that negative experience gets to be the blessing that it was always meant to be. And it was one of the tools that I really loved when learning how to surrender. And I wanted to break that down in the event that it was helpful for you as well. I really appreciate you being here with us. And I hope that you have a beautiful morning, day, evening, or night.